Hello, everyone. I'm Janet Salmons, Methods Guru for Sage Methodspace, and I'm pleased to be joined today by Ed Ballison and Laura Howe to talk about the Duke Bass Connections program as part of our series about research relevance, and in particular about interdisciplinary research. But before we get started, if you are new to Methodspace, this is a blog community sponsored by Sage Publishing, and we're interested in everything to do with designing, planning, conducting, analyzing research, writing about it, and sharing results in all different kinds of ways. And you can see at the center of this Venn diagram, we have teaching and learning, because we think that whether you are a brand new student, a beginning researcher, or an experienced researcher, we all have something to learn. So I want to just start by asking you to introduce yourselves and then tell us a little bit about the Bass Connections program.
Well, thanks so much, Janet. I'm Ed Ballison, and I'm a historian at Duke, a professor in the history department, also in our public policy school. I'm also vice provost for interdisciplinary studies. And in that role, I have responsibility, along with Laura, who will introduce herself in a second, for overseeing this program, Bass Connections, and we're excited to talk about it with you today.
Hi, everyone. I'm Laura Howe. I'm the director of Bass Connections. So we sit in the Office of Interdisciplinary Studies, and my job is to coordinate the overall infrastructure for this program.
So this is a program that sponsors and conducts research projects that involve a wide range of people. So maybe you could just begin by telling us why you think it is important for undergraduate and master's students, as well as doctoral students, postdocs, to actually participate in research projects with faculty members.
So the core of this program are a set of interdisciplinary research teams that conduct research all year. For the vast majority of students involved, that's for academic credit. And most teams, our average team size is about 10 students. Typically, say 3 are graduate professional students and say 7 are undergraduates, though we also have a lot of variability, smaller teams, larger teams. There's some scale to this program. We have 60 to 70 of them now going every year. And they tackle problems that involve every area of knowledge on Duke's campus. So the rationale behind this is that interdisciplinary and convergent research has just become so essential to our world. Just think of the kinds of problems that we confront. Mitigation of climate change, response to this COVID pandemic, remediating environmental degradation, addressing unequal access to the tech economy. One could go on and on and on and on. These are complex problems that really require integration of very different domains of knowledge and the blending of research methods. And often really quite intense engagement with stakeholders beyond the university. So what's required for this kind of thing is not just collaborative research, but a more complex type of collaboration. And our view is that we need to expose students to that early and often.
So I think the program, gives students the opportunity to dig into these complex problems, but it's also building really important career skills, the capacity to work in teams, to communicate with people with areas of expertise across boundaries, and really to grapple with ambiguity. These are applied real world challenges. So sometimes things don't go as planned, and that's a really important learning lesson as well.
Well, having taught research and also having done field-oriented coursework with students, I think it's very different, from trying to learn by reading and discussing and writing papers and that kind of thing, especially since here Methodspace, we're particularly interested in research methods. So just, from the kind of broad rationale, and also from your experience in doing this, why and how do you think it is important for students to learn research by doing? What do you see coming out of that it's contrasts from kind of more typical research methods types of coursework?
Well, one thing to say at the outset is that we don't at all think that more didactic forms of instruction or the kind of traditional modes of giving people an introduction to an area of knowledge, or in fact research methods, are going to go away.
Right.
We see this as complementary. And sometimes actually having the early applied research experience can spark interest and a desire then to go much deeper in more didactic forms of learning. So it can kind of, I think it's complementary in different ways depending on the circumstances and the students. Our sense is that that having this in the mix, though, is just a really fantastic spark, and enriches student experience for a larger number of learners, and just brings vitality into the effort for everyone. Right. The salience of knowing that you actually are working with an unknown, not just an unknown problem, but one that if you can make some progress on it, might actually get implemented somewhere in some context, or there might be public audiences for the outputs, gives you a level of motivation from the students that you just don't tend to get in more traditional forms of instruction.
So what kinds of roles do students at the different levels who are part of these teams play?
So you mentioned research methods. We should also say that our teams, because these are interdisciplinary teams, cover a vast range of research topics and deploy a huge set of research methods. So even within teams, I think Ed himself can talk about a team he leads where they're doing oral histories and also combining data sets and creating data visualizations. So it's really often driven by the faculty leaders to define the research project and what's needed. But very common things would be setting up a IRB protocol, developing interview tools and guides, conducting focus groups, conducting, online survey polling, taking that data, making sense of it. Many of our teams, we fund teams 1 year at a time, but many teams run across multiple years. And at that point, they begin to develop longitudinal data sets, begin to write publications and public facing outputs. So it's really a huge range of methods that our teams deploy.
That said, it might be helpful to describe the typical pattern for a team. So this is over a whole year, and you might think of this in quarters. So in the first quarter of the year, the first phase, especially with a new team, what the experience may look a little bit more like traditional instruction. There's going to be a lot of level setting. There's context that students have to understand in order to be able to dig into the problem, and some of that may even involve things like lectures, readings, viewings. But the point of it is very clear from the beginning. There's a scaffolding around what the problem is that the students understand, I think, which is really important. And the point of that initial level setting is to solidify sometimes a handle on research methods, but often the question of problem definition, and the setting of a research agenda and the organizing of that agenda by the team. It may involve, in many cases, going through the institutional review board, so you're gonna have to put that proposal together. But clarifying team roles is really crucial. And often what we see is a differentiation between those with more experience, graduate professional students, and undergraduates. Sometimes the advanced undergraduates take on something of a leadership role as well. And then often there's a sub-team structure where teams can define pieces so that you might have, say, sub-teams of 3 or 4 going at an element of the overall team's work. So then after the level setting, in the second and third quarters, you tend to get a much more of a focus on carrying out research, data collection, analysis. Still might be some level setting, depends, and often there's course corrections that are required for one reason or another, as is the case with any open-ended inquiry. And then in the fourth quarter, a well-organized team is going to start shifting more towards engagement with what are our research outputs? How are we going to communicate our findings now that we've done our data collection and analysis, whatever those methods might be? What interpretations do we want to settle on, and how are we going to communicate those to the audiences that we've decided are important? And then, as Laura mentioned, we have many teams are not just in a single year for their work. They may continue for 2, 3. We've had some teams go for as long as 4, even 5 years. And so then there's a process of bequeathing the endeavor to a new set of students, though often with some overlap of continuing students.
Right. That seems like those steps to communicate research that, for doctoral students who, are suddenly trying to design studies who haven't had this kind of experience, being able to, either, you've got this like gigantic, it's going to take me a half an hour to describe this, or else, how do you explain it to somebody who is, outside of your discipline or outside of academia? So it seemed like those would be, very useful skills for students to gain, whether they're going on to a graduate program or not. Do you see a pattern of, especially for the undergraduate students, of being more interested in research-oriented advanced degree, or
I think
thoughts
they're
about how they might apply it in their professional lives?
I think they're interested in research in many different guises, some of which are academic, and often research which is not necessarily academic. We have I think when a team works well, there's a good balance between scaffolding from the faculty members and input from the students. There's some type of democratic decision-making process, and there's a tremendous focus on communication, because you often got people doing different pieces of the larger endeavor who are working through different types of research methodologies. And so they have to communicate with their peers. They're presenting all the time. And that I think, as Laura was saying earlier, really equips people with some very important skills that are relevant in a lot of different contexts. I have a former student now on the team that I'm still co-leading. We're in year 3. That student graduated from university as an undergraduate and was able to get a job at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau and is engaged in all kinds of incredibly interesting research, but for a government agency. And that individual may circle back to academia at some point for additional training. I have no idea what his trajectory in the end will take. But I'm just thrilled that our team, which has been looking at the run up to the financial crisis and the dynamics in residential mortgage markets in individual states, that he was able to leverage that experience into such a great initial first job.
Could you just briefly walk us through an example of, either a project that you've done recently or one of that's now, just kind of give us a thumbnail sketch of how the steps fit together?
Yeah, so I think one really good example of a team that has integrated many different disciplines. We had a team that ran for about 4 years. It was called the Pocket Colposcope. This was led by a faculty member in biomedical engineering and faculty in our Global Health Institute. And the faculty member in engineering had developed a low-cost portable device for screening for cervical cancer that could be deployed in the developing world. She already had the device. They were still tweaking the device. So there was an engineering component of, making improvements to that device. But really what the team looked at is, okay, you have a device, but it takes a lot more to actually deploy this. So they worked on regulatory approvals. So they had students from the law school working on regulation. They had students from the business school and our innovation and entrepreneurship initiative looking at how to actually scale the program. They did in-country partnerships. So they partnered intensively with health clinics in Peru to actually deploy the device, get feedback from clinicians on the use of it, what would make it easier, and then also engaging with patients on their perceptions of this new device, looking at kind of cultural context around, how people talk about cervical cancer, how people engage with those issues. And
so for
now they're at the
for that piece, they had sociology students.
Right.
Policy students, health students, engineering students. And so the device has now been cleared by the FDA and has approval in several developing countries and has been deployed in 8 different countries at this point. So having a real concrete impact on people.
Right.
And it's driven grants from the NIH. It's led to all kinds of publications, in addition to this very tangible real world impact,
right.
Which has been the point of it.
And for those students to feel that they've been able to contribute to something that is going to have such a, potential for real, making a real difference in the world is, that's got to make them feel like this was something worthwhile.
Absolutely. So to your earlier question, we see students who find a passion and they really explore it. They create theses and dissertations around their experiences. They use it to shape their career paths. We see that all the time, and it's amazing. The other thing we've heard from students, less often, but an experience like this can help you figure out, actually, I'm not passionate about this, or I'm passionate about this topic, but you know what? I don't really like coding interviews. I really like doing data analysis, right? So really helping them find those passions.
Well, one of the really fascinating things about this team is that it also spun off a secondary project that involved much more humanistic method around ways that you could use artistic expression and documentary storytelling to convey the work of the team and the crucial goals around preventative health in general, but specifically around cervical cancer as a very preventable disease.
Right.
And this, but the thread underneath that was also empowering women to take control of their own health. So if you think about the trajectory as a whole for this team, there's literally almost no part of the university which wasn't drawn on eventually as part of the work of this group.
Right. I have actually one more question kind of about that process, because as we know, I mean, higher education is typically a very competitive scene and very oriented towards individual performance and, the grade that you're going to get and how that is going to influence your GPA and other opportunities. So, how do you kind of introduce to these students the value of collaborative work that also is going beyond the discipline? So you're going beyond what is familiar to you or what what you've thought your primary interest was. How do you introduce those concepts and ensure that people are approaching it with a mindset that is open to this kind of process?
That's a great question. One thing to stress is that the program is not necessarily attractive to every faculty member at Duke or every student. But we have many faculty at Duke with interdisciplinary inclinations and who have chosen their own intellectual path because of their desire to contribute applied knowledge, or to, even if they're engaged in more basic kinds, more fundamental kinds of research, to do that, tackling issues that one discipline or one person really just can't make progress on without collaboration. And they've been attracted to Duke partly because we think, they perceive, and I think they're correct, that we have some capacity to do this well. And I would say this is even more the case for our students, many of whom I think increasingly, this is a generational dynamic, I think, are focused on big problems. They're eager to work together to try and solve them. Having said that, there are a lot of concrete issues that we have to think about very carefully. What's fair grading on a team?
Right.
How do we guide people who haven't done this type of collaborative research before to avoid common pitfalls? And I guess I would just invite Laura maybe to talk a little bit about our evaluation process and how that has helped us to, I think, improve the structures of support for both faculty and students to increase the percentage of teams that function well and that get to this point of productive collaboration, even if their outcomes turn out not to be so fantastic, because sometimes research, open-ended research, leads to cul-de-sacs.
Right.
But I think, if you would talk maybe, Laura, a little bit about the evaluation process.
So we have an annual evaluation we do of our students and faculty, and that's been a key feature of the program since the very beginning. And we've really used it as an iterative process to say what's working on teams, what's not working well, and over time have identified, common best practices for which we've developed a set of resources that we'll have available through the website for teams on how to grade collaborative research, how to, use tools like a project charter to make sure that everyone's on the same page about their goals, the roles of students. So we've been very intentional about feeding all of that information back into the program. I would say, if I were to, some of the common trends, I think the biggest piece of feedback or the best practices that we've seen is that it's really critical for all members of the team to understand the goals of the project, the roles that each student and each team member are playing to contribute towards those goals, and then the project timeline. I think there can be a tendency on these large, complex teams for maybe the leaders to have a clear vision, but if they don't convey that to students, it becomes very hard for students to contribute. We've mentioned the fact that we have graduate students on teams. We've seen repeatedly in our evaluation feedback how critical that kind of middle mentorship role can be. So we've really encouraged teams to assign a graduate student to serve as a project manager so that they can mentor undergraduate students in an accessible way and help faculty also kind of keep the train moving throughout the year. So there's a lot we've kind of fed back into our resources.
The other point I would just add to that is the significance of paying attention to social bonds. Right? Teams have to actually cohere, and that means people have to get to know each other, especially across difference. Our teams end up being incredibly diverse in all kinds of ways, not just the interdisciplinary character of people's backgrounds and intellectual focal points, but also where they come from, what their life experience has been. So, we really emphasize team building exercises, even if they have initially almost nothing to do with the subject matter, because if people get to know each other, they work better together.
Right. Well, for those who are watching this discussion, this is a kickoff for an entire series that will explore some of the kinds of ideas that we've talked about here in more depth and provide some practical how to, whether you are in an environment where you might think about launching, a larger scale project as Ed and Laura have described here today, or whether you're a faculty member who's thinking, how can I make my research methods classes more experiential or add some projects that would be, more engaging and give them that kind of real world connection. So please follow through the methodspace.com and you'll find this series, and we look forward to exploring these topics and also, hearing from others who are trying to engage students in this kind of interdisciplinary collaborative work. So thanks, Ed and Laura, for kicking this off, and we look forward to this series with more interviews with people who've been involved with these kinds of projects and guest posts that include links to some of the resource materials you've created that others can adapt for their own use.
Thanks, Janet.
Thanks so much, Janet. This was just a great opportunity, and really enjoyed the discussion.